Welcome to this explainer. Today we're exploring the chains and the route, the history of the transatlantic trade. Now we're tackling a history today that is, deeply sobering, but it's absolutely essential to understand. Because this isn't just a story of immense human tragedy and suffering, though it certainly is that. It is literally the fundamental foundational story of the modern Americas. The world we live in right now, it was built directly upon the events we're about to discuss.
Okay, let's dive into this. 12.5 million. I really want you to take a moment and just let that massive, almost incomprehensible number truly sink in. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, over 12.5 million men, women, and children were violently torn from their homes in Africa. I mean, we are talking about the absolute largest forced displacement of people in all of human history, and its legacy, it reverberates globally to this very minute.
To wrap our heads around the sheer magnitude of this event, we're going to follow a specific historical arc. We'll trace the roots and routes, the unimaginable journey of the Middle Passage, the New World destinations, the fierce pushback in maroonage and resistance, the path to abolition, and finally, we'll look at the enduring legacy of those 12.5 million displaced people.
So, Section 1, Roots and Routes, the African Origins and the Shift.
Before European powers even arrived, West and Central Africa were home to these incredibly prosperous, complex kingdoms. Think of the empires of Mali, Congo, and Benin. They had highly advanced trade networks and thriving, organized urban centers. Now, it's true that local servitude did exist within these cultures, but it was fundamentally different from the colonial slavery that came later. It was mostly based on debt, or it was the result of local wars, and crucially, it often allowed for eventual social integration or even earned freedom over time. But man, everything shifted with the arrival of Portuguese navigators in the 15th century. To feed this massive, insatiable demand for labor in new colonial mines and plantations, they created what we know as the triangular trade. This was a brutal, industrialized global machine that literally transformed human beings into a worldwide commodity.
Moving to Section 2, the Middle Passage, the journey across the Atlantic.
We really need to lower our voices and approach this part with the utmost solemnity and respect. This maritime route carried captive millions away from everything they knew, straight into a dark unknown. And this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast between the duration of the voyage and the staggering, horrific mortality rate before people even reached land. Voyages lasted anywhere from 1 to 3 agonizing months. People were chained in pairs, crammed into claustrophobic, completely unventilated holds. And the human toll was just devastating. Dysentery, smallpox, and the sheer inhumanity of the conditions led to massive casualties. About 1.8 million souls perished at sea before ever reaching the shore.
Which brings us to Section 3, New World Destinations. Where did they go?
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it completely shatters common geographical misconceptions. When a lot of people think of the transatlantic slave trade, their mind immediately jumps to the United States. But looking at the data, a massive 45% of all displaced individuals were actually sent to Brazil. Another 42% went to the Caribbean. The Spanish mainland accounted for about 9%, while North America, the future United States, received about 4%. So the vast, overwhelming majority of those 12.5 million people were forced into South America and the Caribbean islands.
And upon arrival, what happened? Well, almost 90% of this trade, specifically in Brazil and the Caribbean, was driven by the relentless harvesting of sugarcane, gold, and coffee. In the Spanish mainland, it was mostly silver mining, and in the U.S., it was cotton, tobacco, and rice. The cruel reality we have to understand here is that the brutal labor on these very specific plantations is exactly what directly financed the European Industrial Revolution. The mercantilist economies of Europe flourished entirely on the backs of enslaved people. People who were legally stripped of every basic human right just to generate that unprecedented, world-changing wealth.
All right, Section 4, Marinage and Resistance, the Fight for Freedom. It is absolutely critical to recognize that these 12.5 million individuals were never just passive victims in this system. No way. Fierce, relentless resistance existed right from day one. It started with coordinated rebellions on the very ships that carried them. It continued through the hidden, careful preservation of their customs and religions on the plantations, and it took the form of daring escapes deep into the mountains and jungles. Those incredibly brave escapes led to the creation of palenques and quilombos. These were independent, free communities formed entirely by individuals who had self-liberated. They directly and triumphantly defied the colonial order. We really have to celebrate the leaders of these sanctuaries, brilliant strategists and freedom fighters like Zumbi dos Palmares in Brazil and Bencos Biojo in Colombia. They successfully carved out spaces of real liberty in a world that was absolutely determined to keep them in chains.
Moving on to Section 5, The Path to Abolition, a Century of Dismantling the System.
Let's move to and see how this built, because the end of this industrialized trade was definitely not a sudden burst of goodwill from colonizers. Nope, it was a slow, hard-fought domino effect. It was the relentless pressure of enslaved resistance, combined with shifting global politics that finally forced legislative change. The foundation truly begins to crack in 1791 with the start of the Haitian Revolution. That is the only fully successful uprising of enslaved people in history, which resulted in a free republic and total abolition on the island. By 1807 and 1808, the UK and US finally banned the transatlantic trade route itself, though unfortunately, internal slavery continued. Through the 1820s, newly independent Spanish-American republics began passing freedom of wombs laws, meaning children born to enslaved mothers were legally free from birth. In 1865, the US ends slavery following the Civil War. And finally, the last dominoes fall in the late 1880s, with Cuba in 1886 and Brazil's Golden Law in 1888 becoming the absolute final territories to legally abolish slavery.
And finally, Section 6, The Legacy of 12.5 Million, Shaping the Modern Americas.
Now look, we all know that the legal abolition of slavery did not magically erase structural inequality or discrimination. Those are profound, ongoing battles that continue to this very day. But what we absolutely must recognize is how the African diaspora became this central, indispensable, and foundational pillar of identity across the entire American continent. This impact, it's woven directly into your everyday life. When you listen to cumbia in Colombia, candombe in Uruguay, son cubano, or jazz in the United States, you're hearing the brilliant, resilient musical legacy of Africa. The very food we enjoy, the vibrant religious rituals, and even the unique cadences of the languages we speak across the Americas, literally none of this can be understood without acknowledging the profound, life-giving contributions of the Afro-descendant population.
So the crucial point is this. How do we redefine our American identity, knowing its very foundation is built on the resilience, the struggle, and the rich culture of 12.5 million displaced souls? The story of the transatlantic trade is one of unimaginable cruelty, yes, for sure, but it is also a story of a people who survived, resisted, and ultimately shaped the very fabric of the modern world. Take this question with you today, let it shift your perspective on the history around you, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring the incredible, enduring legacy of this diaspora. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.